So with that, we'll start off talking about some of the cotton insects. This will kind of be a split presentation between myself and Dr. Smith. We'll be talking about a lot of the key insect pests that we plan, or not that we plan, but that we typically find and deal with in Alabama cotton fields. So one of the first things, really the most important thing about a good cotton scout, cotton consultant is, you got to have the tools of the trade. And that, involves everything from a sweep net to a sunblock and a good hat to protect yourself from the sun. So what we've got here is a drop cloth that's 3 feet by 2.5 feet and a 15-inch sweep net. And these are important to have because most of our thresholds are based on either number of insects per row foot or per a set of sweep net samples. So really, in order to really be able to implement the thresholds that our research recommends using for making applications, it's important to have these tools. You can get them from websites like Great Lakes IPM, BioQuip. There's several different ways you can get these sampling tools. A hand lens is good when you're looking at things like aphids or spider mites or silverleaf whiteflies. It's very helpful to have one of those little hand lenses to help you zoom in on the leaves. The cotton insect infestation report is another key thing. Record holding is very important. Understanding what you're looking at and recording what you're seeing in the field. I know for me anyway, I have to write down bug numbers about as soon as I see them or I'll forget them. I start thinking about football or what I'm going to eat for supper or something like that, get distracted. So it's very important that we keep good notes, good records, comments of, growth stage of the crop, things like that. Then also, it's hot and only getting hotter. Alabama's a pretty warm state, and the few months that I've lived here, it's getting really hot on us. So it's important that we have sunscreen, we have, hats to protect our ears and the back of our neck, water, stay hydrated out there, and make sure that we're communicating and somebody knows where we are if we're out by ourselves and, kind of knows to check in on us from time to time and make sure we're doing okay. So with that, there are a lot of different bugs that we can see in a cotton field at any given time. And so it's important to kind of have an idea of what we're looking for at different timings so we're not getting distracted by all the different insects that we may or may not see. Aaron, yes, I'll provide some links for that later. So really, from emergence through the seedling stage, we're primarily thrips are our main insect pests. This year, we saw a lot of grasshoppers and snails and slugs, things like that. So that's kind of what we're looking for through the first 28 days or so of the season. Once we start to square at that point, we're going to really be focusing on plant bugs. Spider mites and aphids can really show up at any point in time during this, but around first square, plant bugs are what we're really sampling for. And then we're looking for things like spider mites. We're looking for things like white flies and aphids as we're going through the field and scouting. Moving into bloom, plant bugs can still be an issue, but that's when your bollworms and stink bugs start to show up. And those stink bugs in particular are really kind of our key insect pest in the state of Alabama. And Dr. Smith is going to talk about stink bug management later in the presentation. Then again, things like aphids, whiteflies, spider mites that tend to be kind of driven by weather, may be found at any time during the season. So it's something that we're not always necessarily intentionally scouting for, but we should always be observing. Every time we're in a cotton field, we should be observing and looking around for signs of injury and the presence of these insects. So I don't want to spend just a whole lot of time talking about some of these pests that are already past us for this year, but hopefully there's going to be a next year, and we need to be thinking about it. So thrips, as I said, are our primary pest of seedling cotton. They're really our most important one, consistently year in and year out. And it is thrips. There we have 1 thrips. We have 100 thrips. I don't know why that S is a constant there, but it is. We're dealing with complex of species: tobacco thrips, flower thrips, soybean thrips, onion thrips. There's a lot of them. We're primarily the tobacco thrips is what we're concerned with. That's our the one that makes up the majority of our complex, and is the one that's starting to develop resistance in some issues. The injury can be caused by both adults and immatures. They'll cause an upward curling of the leaves. Sometimes you'll see a silvery sheen or some crazy cotton if they damage the terminals, where the cotton will start growing multiple main stems. In severe cases and untreated, you'll see death. Not real common unless you do research like we do and you really try to make that happen, but it can happen in fields, rare occasions. Really what we're the most concerned about with thrips is delayed maturity. You see I've got that bolded there. And, a lot of times that can be the difference. A week delay in maturity could be the difference in getting it in before and getting your crop out of the field at the end of the year before a hurricane or something like that. So it's really important that we get a good head start on thrips management and keep our crop vigorous and avoid any delays in maturity. So here's just some images of cotton at the 2-leaf stage. You see just a little injury there on the left and what we would call moderate injury on the right. You can see the cupping is starting to show. The little silvery sheen is somewhat starting to appear there as well. Really not too bad of injury. When you consider this picture in particular, this is probably 4th or 5th true leaf cotton. So this is under substantial pressure here, and you can see those newly emerging leaves, or some of them are black and dead. The other ones are just barely coming out. Really very, very heavy, substantial injury there. So here's just a couple more images of various injuries, and I put the slide there. I hope you can see it on your computer screen. It may be a little small, but just to kind of give you an idea of how we rate damage. And, you may hear us from time to time talking about, we give it a rating of a 1 or we give it a rating of a 5. So this is kind of the scale of what we use. And generally, when we rate thrips injury, we expect to see delays in maturity and possibly reductions in yield based on a 3. That would be our threshold of a time when we need to make a foliar application to protect the crop from further thrips injury and delays in maturity. So I see we had a comment there about cold injury weather or wind injury and thrips injury. That's a good question, and it can be hard to tell the difference. And part of that is going to be sampling. Do you have thrips in the field? That can give you an idea of are thrips doing this, or is it another factor? You see, we've got here that injury tends to be worse when you have poor growing conditions such as cold or herbicide injury or seedling disease. That can really exacerbate the injury and make it worse. We're primarily managing thrips with at-plant insecticides, either neonicotinoid insecticide seed treatments or in-furrow sprays of things like imidacloprid or acephate or Aglogic as a in-furrow insecticides that we're using. We have a foliar threshold when damage is evident and thrips are present. Really, in a lot of research across the cotton belt, you tend to see the highest return on an insecticide application for thrips when it's made at the first true leaf stage. And so we've got this new model that was developed at North Carolina State called the Cotton Thrips Infestation Predictor Model. I like to just call it the thrips model. It's a little bit shorter to say, but it's really a pretty neat thing. If you've tried it, you can go into this website. You just Google NCSU thrips model. You should be able to find it, or cotton tip. It shows up pretty easy on your Google. And you can go in and give it your field location. You can give it your planting date, and it'll give you a window of 5, 7, or 10 days around that planting date. And the model is looking at temperature patterns, rain patterns, things like that. And it's essentially predicting what the thrips will do moving off of wild hosts, and how quickly they'll begin to grow and lay eggs, and the immatures hatch out and feed, and when they'll move onto your cotton, and it can line that up with the susceptibility of your plant based on the weather and how fast the crop is growing. So this is really a good tool to give us an idea of what our relative thrips pressure may be like in a given area for a given planting date. And it can change, based on, we had this year a random quarter-inch of rain came through that wasn't predicted, and it changed our thrips model prediction based on that. So it's important that we look at it, a couple of days before we plant, the day we plant, and then we can look at it a couple of days after too, and make sure there haven't been any big changes. And one other point about this model is it's just pulling local weather data from a given area, so you don't have to put in every field. Really probably a county level, or certainly the nearest community level would be good enough to give you all the fields in that given area. So one kind of seems to, and historically it's been more of a sporadic pest, but in the last couple of years it's becoming a little bit more consistent for us, is grasshoppers. So the species that we're dealing with primarily right now in our seedling crop is the differential grasshopper. They can lay their eggs anywhere from late March all the way through June. It takes them 35 to 50 days. So you can imagine you get a staggered hatch of eggs, and it takes them that long to go through. You have the potential to have grasshoppers in your field for a pretty long time. One female can lay anywhere from 25 to 150 eggs, and if you're in a field with just, every time you take a step, it's like the ground's moving from grasshoppers, you can really just imagine how many immature grasshoppers may be coming. So it's something that is really something that we're trying to pin down. From talking with Dr. Smith about this in the past, it's really just because they're there doesn't mean they're gonna eat every cotton plant you got, but they very well might. So it's kind of a risk thing on when to make treatments. But here's some images of the injury that they do. It looks similar to cutworms. Sometimes they'll kind of cut the plant off in the crook while it's still pushing up, and then they'll feed on the leaves. But you'll see stems, down the row with no leaves, and you'll be, jumping grasshoppers up the whole time you're walking, and that gives you a pretty good idea of what's going on in the field. So here's an image from a field this year in Alabama where the grasshopper didn't quite get that one broken all the way. You can actually see there in the shade, you can see a plant that was cut off by a grasshopper. But so this is kind of what we're looking for, these plants that are snapped off above the soil level, bent over. So what we do know about grasshoppers is they tend to be worse when we have dry winters. They tend to be worse in lighter sandy soils, and then reduced or no-till situations. I think we feel pretty confident saying that if you've had a field that's had a problem with grasshoppers in the past, you're likely to have problems with grasshoppers in the future if we're in a dry winter, things like that. So, we're putting out an insecticide to burn down something like a growth regulator like a Dimlin or something like that can control these immatures. Can be a good way to go to really reduce the risk of getting losses of your stand from grasshoppers. So another one that's not actually an insect, so you don't get too upset with us that we don't know just a whole lot about this one, since it's not an insect, but snails and slugs. They seem to be really a growing phenomenon for us. These snails, everything you read in the literature suggests that they're not actually feeding on the leaves. Most of these feed on dead tissue, but for whatever reason, they're crawling up and breaking the plants over and causing stand loss. So whether they're feeding or not really doesn't matter, because at the end of the day, they do have the potential to do damage. So you notice snails obviously are different from slugs. Snails have the shell. They'll come up on the plant during the day, and I guess for lack of a better term, they'll just hang out up there. Like I said, they don't appear to be feeding. I don't know if they're sucking juices from the leaves or what, but they'll be up there during the day, just hanging out and congregating together. Slugs, on the other hand, slugs will feed. Excuse me. Slugs will feed on leaves. You get a lot of this kind of irregularly shaped holes along the leaf margins. Slugs are one of those pests that when you come out in the morning, you don't see any damage, or in the afternoon, you don't really see any defoliation in your plants. You come back the next day and there's holes everywhere. Well, those slugs are hiding out in the soil and underneath, the leaf trash stuff during the day, and at night when it's a little bit cooler, they'll come up and feed. Snails would differentiate from slugs because they don't have a shell. They're going to be small, kind of dark brown or black, depending on what time you see them. But slugs absolutely will feed on leaves. They will cut stems similar to what you see with cutworms and things like that. So that really brings up the question of what do we do about them? They're not insects, so insecticides provide no control. There's been a lot of tests and trials and things, and nothing really seems to do anything to them. We can identify some things. We know that they tend to be worse and reduced in no-till systems. Times when you can't get the furrow closed, you can create what we call a slug highway, where they can just work down the furrow and eat seeds or eat seedling plants all the way down. There are some baits available for slugs. They've got no activity on the snails, but they contain iron phosphates or metaldehydes. The problem is they're pretty expensive and moderately effective at best. So really, I think cultural controls are going to be our best way to control slugs and snails. Getting good burn down, not planting in wet conditions, making sure that we've got the tops of the beds clean and good planting conditions, I think, are going to be probably our best way to manage these guys. So now I'll talk a little bit about aphids. We're moving into some pests that we're starting to see in fields currently. One female aphid going through the asexual reproduction can give birth to 30 to 80 immature females at one time, which are then born pregnant and can give birth in 4 to 7 days after being born. So as you can see, we can really have a lot of generations of these things pretty quick if conditions are right. These females are laying eggs. They're already pregnant and ready to lay eggs, and we can really get into some trouble in a hurry in those situations. So here's just an up close of the different forms, colors, some with wings, some without wings, that you may see. You can see the cast skins where the aphids have grown, molted, and left their skin there, kind of like a snake. They'll leave those cast skins there and grow to the next size. The way that we know it's an aphid is we look at these. They're called cornicles. I've heard them described as tailpipes before, with these little spine-looking things that stick off of their rear end, and that's where the honeydew that they secrete comes from those body parts. So that's how we can make sure that we're identifying aphids using those hand lenses that I talked about at the beginning of the presentation. So thankfully, we've got some good ways, or I guess helpers out in the field, biological control agents, things like lady beetles can feed on aphids and try to keep suppressions suppressed. There's some parasitic wasps and things that will feed on mummies or feed on aphids and cause what we call aphid mummies, which is what these big tan, fat-looking aphids are. And then, of course, the aphid fungus really comes in and does a good job for us at some point in the season. We're starting to pick up some aphid fungus around the state already, so that's a good thing. Hopefully, it can help us to avoid insecticide applications. But sometimes insecticide applications are necessary for aphids, particularly when plants are drought stressed. You can see some issues with aphids. If you have heavy populations building, early or late in the season, combined with drought stress, that's a problem. If you got aphids building when bolls are starting to open, you can get honeydew on cotton, which is something that we really want to try to avoid. But really, another time that's key to maybe consider controlling aphids is if you look in the terminal of this cotton plant here, you see all these aphids. And, I don't know that I could find a bollworm egg trying to thumb through all this. It's sticky from the honeydew. There's all these aphids everywhere. It's near impossible to find a bollworm egg in a situation like this. So if we're getting near the flight, the bollworm flight, and we're finding a lot of aphids in our in terminals and things, we may consider making an application to manage aphids. But really, to scout for aphids, like I mentioned earlier, we're really just kind of walking and observing. You're looking for the honeydew on the tops of leaves, from the aphids on the leaf above it. They're dropping honeydew, or you can flip over leaves and look for the appearance of aphids as well. And our thresholds are really just kind of based on professional judgment in a way. Just that feeling of, hey, we're getting a little drought stress, we may need to make a spray, or you're worried about the fungus being too late to slow them down. But generally speaking, we try to wait on the fungus to make applications. So another one, spider mites. These guys are very weather driven. The incidence of spider mites, I think at some level they're probably in the field all the time, but as long as conditions don't get too hot and dry for extended periods, we generally can manage them pretty well without having to spray. Historically, if you look through the literature, spider mites begin on ditch banks, on field borders, and then move their way into the field. It seems like in recent years, that trend is kind of changing, and we're starting to see aphids, really throughout the field. They're not beginning in localized areas on field edges, and part of that's probably got to do with the move to reduced and no-till and cover crops. There's a lot of benefits with those things, but if we don't get good burn down, we've got weeds in the field that the spider mites are on. And then when our crop comes up and those weeds finally die off, or we come back and get a post application of a herbicide, then the spider mites move on to the plants in the middle of the field, and then it gets hot and they blow up. See here, in good conditions for spider mites, they can go from egg to adult in as little as 4 or 5 days. So they can really build up quick. If you're on a weekly schedule, you can be watching a hot spot today and come back next week and they've exploded. So there's something that we really need to keep an eye on and watch for. Here's some of the symptoms, spider mites, that you'll see. Some of this white speckling on the leaves generally kind of starts along the leaf vein and works its way out. It starts out as kind of a whitish color, and as injury progresses, it will turn more of this reddish color here that you see. And we do still tend to see them as hot spots throughout the field. So you can see these red arrows are pointing at a couple of different spots where the mites came in pretty early on some some seedling stage cotton and did some defoliation and things. And like I said, they can really blow up quick. A lot of times, if we get a well-timed rain, that can beat them back and help the plants to outgrow them. But there is a chance that if we turn hot again for another 7 or 10 days, they can build back up. So as I said, worse and hot, dry conditions are following, sequential applications of broad spectrum insecticides that are knocking out all the beneficials and don't have any impact on the spider mites at all. It can really make the problem worse and flare the mites. Our threshold, again, kind of requires a little bit of professional judgment. When mites are widely distributed and leaf modeling is common. So when you're seeing a lot of symptoms across multiple areas of the field, it may be time to make an application, but maybe the weatherman's telling you got a 80% chance of thunderstorms tomorrow. Well, maybe we can wait and hold off and see if that rain's enough to beat them back. But we don't want to jump the gun too early on these guys because we've got resistance building and things like that. So it's important we only make applications when we need to. So now moving into tarnished plant bugs, kind of our big pest in squaring cotton, and then a little bit into the flowering stage in Alabama before the stink bugs come in and take over the show. But so these plant bugs are they're gonna start on weedy hosts. Fleabane is one of the main plants that they'll begin their development on. Females can lay anywhere from 50 to 150 eggs that'll hatch in 7 to 12 days, and it takes roughly 15 to 21 days for these plant bugs to go from hatchling, first instar immature, all the way to an adult. And after about 7 days, the adults can start to lay eggs themselves. The females can lay eggs themselves. So you can see these generations can really start getting going on us pretty quick, and we can run into an issue with plant bugs. So here's some images of an adult plant bug and a couple of images of immature plant bugs. The immatures, they look similar. They're just green, but they really look pretty close. On the drop cloth, sometimes you may confuse a plant bug with an aphid or something like that, but aphids are going to be very still on a drop cloth, where immature plant bugs are going to be running around and moving pretty quickly. So the kind of two key characteristics of adult plant bugs is this triangle on the top of their wings, and then these two white dots that you see the orange arrows pointing at. Those are the key characteristics of adult plant bugs. And here's just a closer view of the immature. You see it's shaped similarly. This is a later instar immature where the wing buds are beginning to form, and this one's getting close to being an adult. So, early in the season, during the squaring period, plant bugs are moving into the field when our fleabane and weeds, ditch bank weeds are drying down. Plant bugs are moving into the cotton fields, and they're doing two things. They're feeding on pinhead squares, and they're laying eggs that will soon develop into immatures that will do damage as well. So here's a couple of images. What we're looking for when we talk about square retention, we're looking for squares that have been fed on and dried down and fallen off the plant. We're looking for these abscission scars, we call them here. You can see where there should be a square there on that node. So square retention is very important for a couple of different reasons. It gives us an idea of what's going on in the field now. It can give us an idea of insecticide efficacy if we make an application for plant bugs. We're dealing with adult insects, which can move into the field over several weeks. So it gives us a good idea of what our insecticide did last week based on the square retention in the upper three nodes this week. And so that's What we like to look at is just pick randomly, look at 25, 50, 100, however many squares you need to, for depending on how big your field is. Look in the upper 2 or 3 nodes for the presence or absence of squares. Sometimes, in that node in the terminal, you can do more damage thumbing through trying to find the square than the plant bugs themselves are doing. So for me, if I can't look at a terminal node and pretty easily see the square, I don't worry with it. I just go to the second and the third node, like I said, because you don't want to do more damage than good. But again, here's what we're looking for. We're either looking for precision scars or where a missing square is. We're looking for blasted square, which is what we call these dried off squares that are there, or a flared square is also a sign of plant bug feeding. So we're keeping up with the number of missing or damaged squares compared to the total number of squares, and our threshold is based on that at 80% square retention. So here's some more images of dirty squares from plant bug feeding. They're going in and feeding and secreting their they're going to the bathroom and things like that, and kind of staining these squares up. And we see a dirty square will turn into a dirty bloom, which is what you see here. So these are more signs of plant bug injury. These flowers, you'll see all the staining and things. Often you'll see plant bugs running around, having parties in these white blooms. Sometimes if the square was damaged enough, the blooms they just won't look normal. They'll be a little bit shorter than a normal bloom will be, or look a little misshapen. And really, there's nothing we can do about a dirty bloom at this point. We don't have any thresholds based on dirty blooms, because a lot of this injury was done when it was a square, but it is an indicator of what plant bugs have done in our field. So one other plant bug, so generally speaking, we're most concerned about tarnished plant bugs, but there is another plant bug, the clouded plant bug, which seems to be making up a higher proportion of the population than I think you would normally expect. This clouded plant bug it's a little bit larger, more robust than the tarnished plant bug. The characteristics there for both the adult and the immatures are these really thick first segment of its antennae. You see right here with this arrow, and then also the very pronounced hind leg is a characteristic. Same thing for the immature. You still see that very thick first segment of the antennae, and then the hind leg is very large and robust. So clouded plant bugs are generally they tend to be more prevalent in wet springs. Buttonbush is thought to be one of the important hosts for these guys. So they're developing on that and then moving it into the cotton field later. They can do a little bit more damage than tarnished plant bugs. Are a little larger and more robust. Sometimes you'll see some of this cat facing and things on smaller bowls. There may or may not be any internal injury based on that, but that's one thing that you can see from clouded plant bugs. But as far as our thresholds and things like that, we're really considering them all to be the same from pinhead square to about the third week of square, and right around bloom. We're looking at square retention. We want to maintain at least 80% square retention. We're also looking at bugs in the sweep net of the threshold of 8 bugs per 100 sweeps. And then starting around the third week of bloom and third week of squaring, and then all the way through bloom, we're going to swap to the drop cloth as plants get a little bit larger. We start to get immatures hatching from eggs that were laid earlier in the season, and that we're primarily focusing on them. And our threshold is 3 bugs per drop at that point. So it's very important that we're out in the field with these drop cloths when we can, looking for immature plant bugs, which are really small at times, but they can really do a lot of damage. So with that, I'd like to just put in a couple of little plugs before we move on to Dr. Smith's portion of the presentation. We've got the cotton IPM guide. That's on the ACES website. You can find it. You just type in Alabama Cotton IPM guide. It shows up pretty quick. And we've got all of our thresholds in there. We've got some background information on the different insects that you may go across, as well as some beneficial insects. We've got rating scales for effectiveness of our different insecticides against the different pests that we're going against. So really a good resource that Dr. Smith has kept up for a long time, and has a lot of really good up-to-date information that's always there for your use. I'd also like to plug our Alabama Crops Report newsletter. So a newsletter that started this year. We get a lot of updates from our extension specialists and regional folks across the state, trying to give you the most up-to-date and timely information that we can about what's going on in the field and in your area today. And then Dr. Steve Brown's got the Alabama Cotton Shorts newsletter, which is a really good newsletter, primarily focused on cotton. The Alabama Crops Report is all crops, but the Cotton Shorts newsletter is updates on cotton. That goes out about once a month. Is that right? Yeah. Monthly, the Cotton Shorts newsletter goes out. And then, Dr. Smith and I are always trying to put out timely tweets, things like that. So you can see our Twitter accounts there and our phone numbers. We're always available by, phone call, email, text, whatever. If you got something you're not sure about, please let us know. That's why we're here. And then also I'll plug the Pest Patrol update sponsored by Syngenta. You can text PestPad 11 to 97063, or just Google Syngenta Pest Patrol and go through and find Alabama and get good weekly updates on what's going on, what we're seeing and kind of what to do about it at that time.
So, that was a nice job by Dr. Graham. I remember my first one in 1972. I was a little bit nervous and shaky, talking to about 65 or 70 scouts at that time, and the room was packed, and I was under a lot of pressure. Anyway, good to be with you. We're going to get right into it and move as fast as we can through here. I'm going to concentrate on the caterpillars, the worms, and stink bugs with the techniques, IDs, threshold, and management. This is a chart that I like to use. I prepared the chart way back in 1985, and my purpose was to show that different pests have kind of different times of the year when they're going to be most likely at damaging levels, and the darker bars are the most likely, and the lighter bars maybe. And you'll notice we even had boll weevils and things like that in the chart. I've never updated it, but we have some new pests that could be added to it now, but it still serves a purpose. And I use this to alert scouts that there are certain times of the year that they should concentrate more on particular pests. So if you'll notice, that kind of goes through the time of the year, the month, and so forth, and the different insects. So, and the other thing I want to mention is geographically, latitude-wise, from south to north, we grow cotton over a wider area than almost any state east of Texas. If I can get a pointer here, we grow cotton from a little community of Cottonwood here in the southeast, all the way up to a community of Oakland here in Lauderdale County. If we went over here on the other corner, we grow cotton around Scottsboro and on the Sand Mountain region up in the northeast, all the way down to Grand Bay here in Mobile County, just a few miles north of the Gulf. And we've got distinct pockets of cotton, 2,000 or 3,000 acres or more, and many of those counties in between. So that's a real challenge for us to stay on top of the insects in all those areas. And that's the reason in a normal year we'd be doing 3 different scouting schools in 3 different regions, one in the north for the northern area, one in the Prattville, Montgomery area for central Alabama, and then one down in the Wiregrass for the southeastern area. And we quite often do an in-season scouting school down in the southwestern area. But today we want to start out by talking about bollworms and tobacco budworms. Now, let me go back and just say one thing. It was boll weevils that drove the cotton scouting program for many years until the weevil was eradicated in Alabama in the late 80s or particularly the early 90s. So after then, the bollworms and tobacco budworms were a dominant pest. So that's the pest that drove the scouting program. And then in 96, we moved to the genetically altered plants, and that eliminated the bollworm, the tobacco budworm totally, and the bollworm to some degree. Not quite out of the system, but we did get acceptable control. Now, we've lost a little ground with the bollworm species since that time with resistance to our genes. But anyway, my point is we cannot tell the difference in the color of the caterpillar between these two different species. We can on the adult stage, but the tobacco budworm since 1996 has really been out of the system and out of the picture on cotton. We still deal with it on some other crops. The adult stage, though, does look distinctly different. We've got the tobacco budworm on the left. It's a smaller moth, a little bit of a yellow greenish color with some bands on the wings, whitish bands. The corn earworm or the bollworm species is a darker, more buff-colored brown with some areas of bands on the back. Now, quite often we suggest that scouts at certain times of the year be looking out ahead of them as they're walking in the fields to just see the presence of some of these. They'll normally get up out in front of you a little bit and fly a few rows over, but you can get an idea of the activity of these, particularly the corn earworm or the bollworm species, as you walk through the field. Now, once these adults deposit the eggs, they go through the larval cycle, and we'll show pictures of those in just a second. But then they spend about 10 days underneath the soil as a pupal stage. So that kind of completes the life cycle. But you see the two dark areas on the bollworm on the right, the two dark spots on the wings. That's a pretty distinguishing characteristic for them. When these moths deposit the eggs, they're small, very small. They're pearly white the first morning. A lot of them are laid late at night. And if you look at them with a 10x magnifying glass, you'll see a little bit of ribbing on them, but they are definitely perfectly round in shape. Now, it takes about 3 days for this egg to hatch, and during that time, they turn a little bit more of a brownish and then a darker color right before they hatch. If this is a good point to show, you can see the developing larvae inside. The head capsule will be a little darker than the body, and you can see the ribbing on the egg itself. Now, where are these eggs in a cotton field? We're looking for a needle in a haystack, but there are certain areas of the plant that most likely going to catch or be where the egg is deposited. Now, I always like to look at the terminal first, and quite often early in the season, particularly, and up to about mid-July, a lot of the eggs are deposited in the terminals. If that's the case, I'll show you exactly what to look for on the plant if the egg's deposited in the terminal. If it's not, we'll talk about that in a few minutes, and what happens when it's down further on the plant. This is a classic position for an egg on a terminal of a cotton plant on the new unfurled leaf there. That is a great place, and it's a very fast place to look and see for the presence of eggs being deposited. You can see that in a second on a plant if you've got an egg up in that area. Now, here we move down the plant a little bit on some other leaves, and you see a multiple egg deposition there. Normally, we find one egg in a place. Right at the end of the life cycle of a moth, she may deposit more eggs in a hurry before she dies. So, or it may have been a second moth that came along, but normally one in a place. Now, if the egg was deposited in the terminal, and the little small larvae, when he hatches in 3 days, it's going to start tunneling around in the new vegetative tissue there, and it's going to leave something that looks like this. So this was what we'd call a damaged terminal, a bollworm damaged terminal. Okay, if you dig around in there a little bit, you'll find the little caterpillar, kind of creamy colored body, and again, the dark head capsule is a real helpful identifying character, but he'll tunnel there for a few days and then begin to move into the next first little square and then move down the plant in progressively older squares. So you can, if an egg was spotted in the terminal, you can kind of trail him down the plant as he ages. So that gives us a pretty wide window of opportunity to pick up on that larva, and that'll be opposed to what I'm going to show in a few minutes if the egg was deposited down in the blooming zone. Now, when the egg was in the terminal, when the larvae hatched there, and the leaf unfolds, you get a little bit of ragging like this and see the feeding damage. So that in itself, this picture here would tell me to look close in that terminal. Now, sometimes early in the season when that happens, the beneficial has already taken care of the little caterpillar, but that would allow me to, encourage me to look down for a note or two and see if I can see the larvae find the larvae as he's moving down the plant. As the caterpillar moves down the plant, he's going to be damaging fruit. Here's a little small square that the worm has chewed in. You can get an idea of the size of the caterpillar by looking at the hole that he's made going into the plant. And one way, when you see this, you don't ever want to confuse this with plant bugs. Their hole is non-detectable that they're going to make as they feed on the little small square. But a bollworm is going to make the size of the hole about the size of the head capsule. Okay, as you move down the plant and they feed into a square, normally after a day or two, the bracts around the square are going to flare back, and that stands out. So just walking down a row, you can normally see then if you've got 5-day-old worms, you're beginning to see some flared squares, and that's particularly true if it was deposited in the terminal. So that would give us a clue also. Another picture here just showing about a 5-day-old caterpillar in a larger square. All right, what happens if the egg is not deposited up in the terminal? And I really think later in the season, about the time the vegetative growth of the plant slows down, the moth senses that that's not going to be a good terminal place. The terminal's not going to be a very good place for those tiny caterpillar to feed. And so they'll put them down more closer to a small square or bloom. So here's a bollworm egg on the side of a square down the plant a ways. And other than that, they will go on down, and quite often when the big flack comes off of corn, we get a lot of egg deposition into the blooming zone of the cotton plant, which is distinctly down from the terminal, assuming we are still not in a drought stress situation and the plant's still growing vegetatively and adding nodes. But a good thing for a scout or a field person to do is they're walking across the field, between the time they're stopping, they can be snapping off a dried bloom here and there and just observing real close for the presence of an egg on the bloom. And it's not as easy to see after a day or two as it turns more the color of the bloom. But anyway, they can do that. And also you'd want to be looking underneath that bloom in case the little caterpillar is already hatched. They will be feeding right in the tip of the little bowl underneath the bloom. The bloom tag will still be stuck to it. So it'd be a dried bloom tag at that point. Another picture here where the egg was deposited on the bloom, and it may be on a white bloom, it could be on a red bloom. But another point to make is we get a lot of our escaped worms on our 2-gene cotton. When the egg is deposited on the bloom tags, it's a very low concentration of the BT gene in the bloom, so it gives them an opportunity to feed some on a low concentration bloom and then get inside and go in the tip of the little bowl underneath it. And that is where we find a lot of our escaped worms getting by us on the 2-gene cotton. Okay, if the caterpillar hatches on the bloom tag or even on the square bract, when they move inside, It'll be a very small little caterpillar. You can see by the point of this is a real small knife, and you see the relationship to the bloom. And again, the head capsule helps us to pick up the little caterpillar because their body is going to be somewhat the color of what they're feeding on, which would be the square there. I'm not sure how well this shows up, but this is about the way it's going to look out in the field. You're not going to have a lot to go by, but I love to look in white blooms long in time of the year when the flight's coming off of corn. We'll see a lot of 1- and 2-day-old worms down around the reproductive parts of the flower. And again, the body is just the same color off the background, but the little dark head capsule is a dead giveaway. And this is where a lot of our escape worms are getting by us here. Now, I will say that here in the southeast, and particularly Alabama, we have an abundance of fire ants in the field. And fire ants are, I know, a harmful insect in a lot of environments, but in a cotton field, they may be the most beneficial insect we have because in my area, fire ants are searching white blooms every day. And I think that's one reason we've had fewer escape worms to deal with in our system here than maybe in some other areas of the cotton belt. If a fire ant finds a small caterpillar, he's gone. There won't be a tomorrow for him. So anyway, here's another one that developed in a bloom, and just to give you some idea, just concentrate on that mahogany brown head, and you'll find the little small worms there. So this is probably the easiest way to find small caterpillars on cotton is in the white blooms. Okay, there's a caterpillar somewhere here. It's hard to see on the screen, but I can assure you there's a little head capsule in there. And so just another example of what to look for and how close you'll have to look to find it. Eventually, they're going to become a little larger and maybe 5 days old. You'll find them in a white bloom. We found one this week in some cotton down in southeastern Alabama about this size associated with a white bloom. Now, here's one that stayed with the bloom tag, and it's been my experience that when the egg is deposited on a bloom, they get underneath that bloom or dry red bloom and underneath the dried bloom and feed on that bowl for 5 to 7 days. So there's no other clue on the plant that there's a caterpillar out there other than that one bowl. I believe with our genetically altered cotton, the little bollworms do not like to move from fruit to fruit as well. So they stay with one fruit a lot longer than I think in the old days before we had the BT cotton. So anyway, it makes our scouting job harder, more difficult and harder. But that's the reason we want to really concentrate about mid-season, about where we're at now in mid to late July. We want to really concentrate under bloom tags. So that's where a lot of them are getting away from us. Just a classic example of how to look underneath a dry bloom on a small bowl, and they seem to always like to go into the tip of the bowl. Eventually, it becomes real ugly when they get that down lower in the larger bowls, and the feeding is bad. And if that bowl, if it doesn't fall off the plant, will still be on the plant when the farmer's harvesting, and it will be a brown bowl with a big hole in it that you can see from the cap of the picker. So that's not very good for a scout, consultant, or agri-field man that's doing the monitoring when that happens. So that's what we don't want to avoid. We do want to avoid. Okay, just another classic example of a caterpillar about ready to cycle out on cotton. Now, I just want to throw this in there. There are some other eggs in cotton. Here's one, the big-eyed bug egg. It's a beneficial insect. It's an oblong egg. The yellow striped armyworm, for example, has an individual egg, but they're quite significantly larger than a bollworm egg. So there are a few other eggs, so we don't want to spray on the potential of an egg if it's a beneficial insect. Just an example, we have always said we needed to control caterpillars, the bollworm species, within the first 5 days after they hatch. So that means we've got to detect them, get the word to the grower, get the word to the applicator or the farm and the chemical supplier and make an application when we're above threshold. So that's one of the points I want to make here. The other point I wanted to make is, even with our new chemistry, the diamides that serve to control our bollworms if the pyrethroids are no longer working, we tend to think in the old days, if we paid more for the product, it was cleanup material. Well, the diamides have to be applied at the earliest possible time after they even work best on the egg stage, when applied at the egg stage. But they're not cleanup materials, and you have to have super coverage for those. So if we get into that in the future, just know we've got to spray quick with the new chemistry and have great coverage. Okay, this is what I'm talking about that is visible from the picker seed at harvest time, and that leaves a pretty unhappy grower. Another example here. Okay, we're going to move to another left now, and this is a beet armyworm. Now, we have not had beet armyworms really in Alabama since 1995, but I have kept them in my talks at the scouting school just in case people run into them on other crops or something like that. And just this last week, we found a very uniform infestation of beet armyworms in a soybean field down in Monroe County, Alabama. Not at threshold level, but uniform at about 30 per 100 sweeps all the way across the field. So can't explain it. Beet armyworm is a dry weather pest. We've got some dry pockets, but that wasn't necessarily one of those. But don't think it had a previous insecticide, so I don't know what happened to the Cortesia wasp that normally keep this pest under control. But may have had a herbicide over the top or something, but no insecticide. Beet armyworm. All right, moving to a fall armyworm. When we just had one gene, cotton, the fall armyworm was still in the system and presented a lot of problems beginning in 1996. But when we went to the 2 gene and now to the 3 gene cotton, the fall armyworm is just totally out of the picture, I think, in cotton. But still, we like to let folks know what they look like. Inverted Y on the head capsule, and I may have not noticed it, but the distinguishing, may have not mentioned it, but the distinguishing mark on that beet armyworm was a black dot on the 4th segment behind the head capsule. But back to the fall armyworm now. We still have fall armyworms out there in the system. They're on hay, pastures, athletic fields, nice lawns, things like that. But it's a different strain of fall armyworm than what we're dealing with on cotton and corn. So they're not a problem for us at this time. Another picture of the fall armyworm, just showing the inverted Y on the head capsule. They also, when they appeared in cotton, they love to be in red blooms or get in white blooms and stay there when the bloom closes. And we would pick them up too as we snapped off the blooms as we walked across the field. Another picture of the fall here in a bloom. And this is back in the older days, this was what we'd see with fall armyworms. They'd get inside the bract on our older boughs near the bottom of the plant, and they would do some etching, and it would leave this kind of mark visible for the scout if they just bent the canopy back and looked. All right, you can see where they scaled off the inside of the bract there. And again, here's a fall. They also have a dark head capsule, but they're a little bit darker larvae. But this is where we would always find them early, either in a bloom or at the base of a large bowl. Fall armyworms come from an egg mass. Normally, we only had a few survivors out of an egg mass, and that was a little bit different. The egg mass was always low on the plant and on the bottom side of the leaf. Now, there is another armyworm, the beet armyworm we mentioned just a while ago. They also lay the eggs on the bottom side of the leaf, but when most of them survive and move away from the mass. When they do, they're scaling off the lower surface of the leaf, leaves a little telltale sign like this on the top. You normally find this around the borders of the field first, and maybe on skippy stands, a plant sitting out in a skip or something. we hope we don't get into those, and I don't anticipate getting into the beet armyworm again. But here's a classic beet armyworm here. You get a lot of survivors out of an egg mass of beet, where you only get 1 or 2 out of an egg mass of the fall armyworm. Again, typical damage from the beet armyworm, and eventually they will move to the blooms and into the bolls. Now here's the beet armyworm, I believe, here with the black dot, and I'm confusing them on my picture here now with the fall. And the fall armyworm is over the second pair of true legs with a black dot. The beet armyworm is on the 4th segment, not the 2nd segment behind the head capsule. All right, we do have, this is a yellow striped armyworm, as I mentioned earlier, a larger, fatter worm, but you'll see an occasional one, but not a pest of cotton. And then we get into the one that we're seeing in the more southern latitudes, this southern armyworm. They're big leaf eaters, and we had a lot of these with the 1 single gene cotton, but we're not seeing very many of them now with the 2 gene cotton, and particularly not with the 3 gene cotton. They do have a row of black dots about 4th segment back behind the head capsule, and they love to feed on the blooms and the foliage. Soybean loopers, I mentioned this, they're really not a cotton pest anymore. They were a significant pest back in the old days before we went to the genetically altered cotton. This is a classic pose. If you're shaking soybeans, for example, which Dr. Graham's going to cover in a few minutes, this is a classic pose for a soybean looper. All right, let's move to stink bugs. We did a banner a few years ago, and I put it up at the scouting schools, and actually it's a little bit too big to get on the screen, but it pretty much told the whole history and how to scout and the details of scouting of stink bugs in cotton, which I consider to be our dominant pest in the coastal plains of the Southeast. And we don't talk a lot about them, but there's probably 2 million acres of cotton in the U.S. where I would consider the stink bug as the dominant insect each year, the most economically damaged insect on probably 2 million acres of cotton. Let's see if we can get some close-ups of some of those. We've got the brown stink bug in the mix, and the immature stage is on the left. It's interesting. The brown stink bug has a green immature stage, and I'll show you what the others look like in just a minute. But lots of times we start out the season, the brown overwinters a little bit better than the green, the southern green. And so we start out the season with more browns than we do have southern greens. But it's been my experience here in Alabama, as we move through July, for some reason, the browns tend to decrease in number, and the southern green, as they begin coming out of corn, they increase in number. So from about late July on, the southern green seems to dominate our population in cotton fields in Alabama. And that's significant from one standpoint, is the southern green is easier to control with pyrethroids, or does a better job. Pyrethroids do a better job than they do on the brown. Here's our southern green. You'll notice the immatures are the mid-size there is green with some white markings on them. And the southern green, when they first hatch, they're black with some little orange markings. And this shows them on the left here coming out of the egg mass, about 50 or so. And they tend to clump after a while, well, they clump, and then eventually they spread from there. And we've got another pest that during mild winters, we're having to contend with statewide. During our colder winters, we only get them down on the Gulf Coast area, and that's the leaf-footed bug. And you can see they got the name from the big projection there on the back legs. Now, the immature leaf-footed bugs are shown on the left. They look quite like the other. They're quite different than anything else in a cotton field, and you'll notice they are orange in color, so I'm assuming they're Auburn fans because of that. So I've always thought that. So anyway, we'll leave it at that. But anyway, in recent years, this insect is appearing all the way up to the Tennessee line. Now, the importance there, the damage is just like stink bugs, so we're going to pick up the damage while we're looking for internal injury to bolls. But the leaf-footed bug is difficult to control, and we really don't think that pyrethroids do a very adequate job on the leaf-footed bugs. So at that point, if that's a big part of the mix of feeding on bolls, we have to use a more of a phosphate insecticide, the Bidrins or the orthines. Okay, how are we going to scout a field for stink bugs? We're going to pull a random sample of quarter diameter bolls, and that's a boll to me that's still a little spongy to the touch. We want it soft enough to where we can actually crush it between our fingers and our thumb and look for internal injuries. So we're going to pull those. Now, we say to avoid field edges, but quite often the field edge will give us a misreading thing, because a lot of stink bugs, they're kind of, I term them lazy flyers. They like to sit down in the first 50 foot of a field initially. So if you want to pick them up early, I would suggest pull a sample strictly from the field borders, and then another sample further out in the field, and see if they're field wide or if it's just primarily on the borders. We say 1 boll per acre and no less than 25 per field. I think that's a pretty good rule. There's a time limit on how long a field person has to burst those bolls, but I would feel real comfortable with 25 bolls from most fields, or at least from the area of the field where you're stopped at that time. If we're talking about a 300 or 400 acre field, we definitely want to pull 25 bolls from more than one side of the field. But the other thing we want to notice with when we're pulling these bolls is cotton adjacent to corn is going to have a lot more stink bugs than probably on the border adjacent to corn than anywhere else in the field. Now that's true if we're into the peanut cotton landscape, because they tend to come out of peanuts really throughout most of the season. In corn, they're going to come off when the corn's maturing down pretty much in a short window of time there. But peanuts, they tend to drift in seemingly the entire months of June and July and August. Anyway, we're going to sort the bolls in 2 piles. We're going to sort them in those that's got obvious external lesions, and I'll show you a picture of that in a minute. And we're going to put those in 1 pile, and we're going to inspect those bolls for internal injury. And I'll have some pictures here. I'll mention just a second. On the boll wall, we're going to look for some warts. We're going to stain lint or stain seed. And if we don't reach a threshold with those bolls that already show an external injury, we're going to check the remaining bolls for internal damage. And we're going to treat then if the threshold is met for that particular week. And I consider the stink bug threshold in cotton to be the best threshold we have of any pest. Some of the best research was done, and some of the most latest research was done on stink bug of cotton, and we considered a sliding or a dynamic threshold beginning, and we like to focus on the week of bloom, and that's a real good measure of where we're at. But the first week of bloom, you don't have a lot of bolls at risk, or we can go with a 50% damage threshold with internal bolls. Moving into week 2, 30%. Then weeks 3 through about 6, 10% injury. And then as the cotton matures out, we got fewer and fewer bolls at risk. So we raise that threshold again to 30 and 50%, as we only have a few bolls in the terminal that may have time to produce. And that keeps us from spraying and getting little or no return on their investment with the spray. Let's move down in the other corner there, the right-hand corner. You see clearly the big wart there on the side of on the internal side of the boll, and then you see the external damage on the boll on the right with the feeding signs, the discoloration on the inside. This is a little chart that was developed by the southeastern entomologists with basically the same information with scouting techniques, and the only thing this shows is the size of the boll that we want to pull when we're sampling cotton. As I've sampled cotton, if you go in for a 10 or 12 day old boll that's still a little soft to the touch, some people have a difficult time finding that boll, but once you find where they're at on the plant, there will be one or two bolls at most that are the perfect size that week. And they'll be in about the same area of the plant, about the same node above the ground or below the terminal. So really it becomes a pretty fast thing once you kind of can figure out where they're located. Now, if you put a hand on a boll and it's real hard and still small, there's a real good sign that a stink bug has already damaged that boll. You can put it in your count if you'd like, but I can tell you that a high degree or a high percentage of the bolls that are real hard prematurely have been damaged internally. But the size here, once you get accustomed to the size boll you're looking for, you don't need to measure every boll with this little card. They're nice to have initially, but definitely don't spend all day sizing up your bolls. If they're spongy to the touch, they probably are susceptible to stink bug injury that particular week, and that's what we're focused on by that size boll. That is the damage. What we're trying to measure is the damage that was done that week, and that's the size boll we can pick that up in. The older bolls would be older damage. Younger bolls would probably not be attractive yet to stink bugs. Now, let's back up here. This is a Georgia publication that was prepared back in, I believe, 2017 when we got into silverleaf whitefly, and it's excellent publication. We've used it here as far as scouting technique, what the threshold is, and so forth. And basically, I'm just going to highlight, if Dr. Graham would like to pitch in here, we have had some experience already this year with the silverleaf whitefly, and we're not totally cold on it. We had a pretty bad outbreak in one area of the state in 2017, but really no real problems in 2018 and 19. But it looks like we do have the potential this year of getting back into problems in the historical areas where we have had silverleaf whiteflies in the past. It's a bad pest of cotton. But anyway, they occur, the adults will be clustering in the terminals, and they deposit eggs underneath the bottom of the leaves. Those eggs hatch into immatures that are kind of like scale insects. They lock down, they're immobile, and they begin sucking honeydew, and you'll see the silvering on the honeydew shiny leaves just like we do from aphids. The key here, I think, is to detect them early. It only takes 3 or so immatures under about 50% of the leaves to be at a potentially explosive level, and a 4 or 5 adults up in the terminal is going to give you a lot of eggs. It's going to be deposited in the next few days. Now, the life cycle of a whitefly is rather short, about 14 days, I believe, and one thing I don't want to forget is when we can look for the presence of these whiteflies clustering in the terminals, but if there's very many there, you can get behind real quick. But when we look for the presence of the immatures, there's a real important point here that our friends from Georgia had keyed in on several years ago. Go to the fifth leaf below the terminal and snap it off. It'll snap off real easy, and look for the presence of immatures there. Now, I was in some fields last week and would snap off the 3rd leaf below the terminal, the 4th leaf, and see very little. I would move down one more node and snap off the 5th leaf, and it was a whole different picture. So that is a real key, is going to that 5th leaf below the terminal and look for the presence of the immatures underneath the leaf. Underneath the leaves. We have several chemicals in our recommendation. The one that has gotten the most use and has performed real good for us is NAC. We have got a state label where 5 ounces can be used at 2 different times with NAC, and that means that we may or may not need that second application depending on the age of the cotton and maturity. I need to also say a couple of things, that this pest is going to be potentially more damaging to later planting cotton, because we're going to have to take that cotton on into September, and the whiteflies tend to increase in numbers once they occur as the season progresses. The other thing is the drier the weather, the worse this pest is going to be. And of course, we've been in a dry week or so here recently, and we've got some pockets that really have not had any rain out of all these scattered thunderstorms, and they are at high risk for the silverleaf whitefly. So rainfall is our friend. Earliness is our friend with cotton, because there's not much we can do about that now. But let me just see if Dr. Graham can would like to add some things. If there's anything we could say, Dr. Graham, that to that, I'd be happy for you to add it.
I think you covered it pretty well. Just, the difference of being too early and too late is pretty short window there. So it's all about timing. A lot of that is just scouting and being in the field and looking at your crop, consistently.
Let me also add that we have had the opportunity to go to some areas this year that were already heavily infested, but we wanted to be up to date for this meeting. So day before yesterday, we made a tour down in the southeastern area of our state and observed a few fields for the presence of silverleaf whitefly. And in our short survey there, we did not find any in Alabama yet, but it's likely just a matter of time, because we've got a long way to go with this season and a lot of our later planted fields in the southern area of the state. Okay, let's see. We've got some pictures here. This would be a picture of adults clustering underneath the leaves. You'll see this up in the terminal, but you can also see it lower down on the plant. Immatures. For the person with average or poor eyesight, these are going to be pretty hard to distinguish. They're a little bit like aphids, and we just picked up from Dr. Philip Roberts last week a little trick here. If they're mixed with aphids, and sometimes they can be, if you'll just wipe this leaf on a shirt, the aphids will come off, and the immature whiteflies being stuck to the leaf as immature scale type insects, they're going to be on the leaf, so we can separate those out right away. But anyway, this is, and really, I think our field people really would be better if they had some 10x magnification. So any store that sells arts and crafts or anything should have something that you can keep in your pocket to get the 10x magnification and separate these from the aphids, the little immature aphids, which are going to be slow-bodied with the little cornicles. And you don't see that in the silverleaf whitefly. I believe on this leaf, we also, you may not on the screen here, but there should be some eggs on here. I know that the eggs are increasing in fields that are infested now, and that means that we've got a real explosion ahead of us in some fields, or we may have before the year's over. With that, we'll close this part and move on to whatever's next. I hope we're close to being on time today. And